What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
I should have seen it coming. It's one of those things you tell yourself after, like some kind of twisted hindsight. You convince yourself that you saw the signs, on the news, in the conversations at work, and the slight uptick in the military planes flying overhead. Maybe it was just easier to ignore it, to pretend the world was still spinning the same way it always had, despite the gnawing sense of something lurking just around the corner. I remember the day everything really started. I was at the grocery store, picking up cereal and milk for Lily. She loved the sugary kind, the ones with the cartoon animals in the box. Even though Sarah hated it, she'd give me a look when I brought it home, but I couldn't resist. Lily's smile was worth it. At the store, everyone's phones started going off, that obnoxious emergency alert tone, the one that makes your stomach flip even when it's just a weather warning. I pulled my phone from my pocket, and there it was in bold letters. Nuclear alert. Seek immediate shelter. There were whispers at first, then panic. A woman dropped her basket and ran out of the store, and suddenly, people started grabbing everything they could. Bottled water, canned food, toilet paper. It was like the beginning of those apocalyptic movies. I should have been terrified. Instead, I stood there, staring at my phone, trying to convince myself it was a mistake. Some kind of hack. Maybe. A glitch. These things don't happen. Not here. Not to us. I paid for the cereal and milk and drove home, ignoring the chaos around me. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, and the radio was just static. By the time I pulled into the driveway, Sarah was outside with Lily. She'd heard the same alert, of course. She looked at me, eyes wide, fear barely a mask behind a calm facade she'd put on for Lily's sake. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice low, like she didn't want Lily to hear. But I could tell by the way she was clinging to her mother's leg that she knew something was wrong. "We stay put," I said, as confidently as I could. "It's probably a false alarm." I could hear myself saying it, like I was trying to convince us both. I knew Sarah didn't believe me, but she didn't argue. What else was there to say? We went inside, shut the doors and windows, and turned on the TV. Every channel was the same. News anchors stumbling over their words, trying to give people directions without having any answers themselves. The camera feeds were shaky, showing grainy clips of missile trails in the sky, maps with red circles expanding over cities. It felt unreal. But then the flash came. Even from miles away, it lit up the sky like a second sun. The power went out a second later, the hum of the fridge and the static from the TV falling into an eerie silence. That was when I knew it was real. That was when the panic hit me like a punch in the gut. "John," Sarah whispered, her voice crackling. "What do we do?" There was no time to think. I grabbed them both, my heart pounding as I led them down to the basement, slamming the door shut behind us. I'd half-assed the shelter down there years ago, after reading some old survival blog during one of the paranoid spells we all go through. I never thought I'd need it. A few shelves of canned goods, some water jugs, and a flashlight that barely worked. It wasn't enough. I knew it wasn't enough. For hours, we sat there in the dark, the only sound the distant rumble of explosions and the occasional shattering of glass upstairs. Lily kept asking when we'd go back upstairs, when the lights would come back on, but I couldn't answer her. Sarah just held her, whispering small, soothing lies in her ear. I couldn't even look at them. Days passed. The explosions stopped. The silence was worse. The air grew thick and stale in the basement. We ran out of water by the third day. We had no choice but to go back upstairs. But the world outside the door wasn't our world anymore. The sky was a sickly gray, like ash had blotted out the sun. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and something metallic that burned in the back of my throat. Our street was empty. Houses stood hollow and broken. Windows shattered. Doors hanging from their hinges. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust. We were alone. I tried to be strong for Sarah and Lily. We scavenged what we could. Found a few half-looted stores. But it was never enough. I could feel the weight of it bearing down on me. The inescapable knowledge that we were just prolonging the inevitable. There was no help coming. There were no rescue missions. No bunkers full of survivors waiting to save us. This was the end of the line. Then Lily got sick. It started with a cough, at first. I thought it was just from the dust, but it didn't go away. She started getting weaker, her skin pale and clammy. Her hair, that beautiful blonde hair that Sarah always braided for her, started falling out in clumps. I knew what it was. I'd seen it on the news, read about it in those old survival guides. Radiation sickness. There was nothing I could do. I watched my daughter die in my arms, and there was nothing I could do. Sarah couldn't take it. She barely spoke after that. Just sat in the corner of the basement, staring at the wall. When the coughing started for her, I knew it was only a matter of time. We buried Lily in the backyard, under the dead oak tree she used to climb. Sarah didn't last much longer. Now it's just me. The food's almost gone. The water ran out 2 days ago. I think about heading to Rob's shelter, but I know it won't matter. I'm already too far gone. I can feel it in my bones, in the way my skin burns under the gray light of a sun I'll never see again. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe it's to remind myself that once I had a family. That once there was a world that wasn't filled with ash and death. I don't know how long I'll last, but I know I'll see them soon. I'm recording this because someone needs to know what happened. If you're reading this, I hope you're somewhere safe. I hope there's still somewhere safe left. It started with the emergency broadcasts. I was driving home from my late shift at the radio station when every channel suddenly cut to that horrible blaring tone. You know the one. We'd all heard it during tests. But this time, it didn't stop after the usual, "This is a test of the emergency broadcast system." Instead, a calm male voice began speaking. "This is not a drill. All citizens are advised to seek immediate shelter. Repeat, this is not a drill." I pulled over to the side of the empty highway, my hands shaking as I turned up the volume. The voice continued listing coordinates of confirmed launches, but I couldn't process the numbers. All I could think about was my daughter Katie, staying at her mother's house 40 miles away. The sky to the east lit up like a second sunrise. I didn't hear the blast, not at first at least. The light was so bright I had to look away, even though it was just on the horizon. When the sound finally reached me, it wasn't what I expected. Not a sharp crack or boom, but a long, deep rumble that I felt in my chest more than heard. I tried calling Katie's mother, but the phones were already dead. The radio had dissolved into static. As I sat there, paralyzed with indecision, I watched other cars speed past me in both directions, some heading toward the city, others fleeing from it. Everyone looking for somewhere safe, somewhere to hide from what was coming. That was 3 days ago. The fallout clouds had turned the sky a sickly greenish brown. I've been broadcasting on emergency power from the station, trying to reach anyone still out there, trying to find my Katie. The radiation meters are climbing, but I'm not leaving until I know. If you're reading this, and you've seen a 12-year-old girl with dark hair and a purple backpack, please, just let me know she's safe. I'll keep broadcasting as long as I can. I have to believe someone's still listening. The station's emergency generators won't last much longer. I can hear them sputtering now, like a dying animal. But that's not what's keeping me up at night. It's the footsteps. They echo through the empty halls of the station after midnight. At first, I thought it was just other survivors looking for shelter. I'd call out, but no one ever answered. The footsteps would just stop, and when I'd check the security cameras, there was nothing but static. Last night was different. I was in the middle of my usual broadcast, reading out names from the missing persons list that people had slipped under the door before the air got too bad to go outside. That's when I heard it. The sound of a child laughing. It came from Studio B, down the hall. Katie's laugh. I'd know it anywhere. I ran to the studio, but when I got there, the room was empty, except for one thing. A small handprint on the dusty mixing board. A child's handprint. The same size as Katie's. The radiation counter in that room was off the charts. I've been getting more calls lately, breaking through the static. People claiming they've seen their dead loved ones walking through the ashes storms. A woman in what's left of the suburbs said her husband, who died in the initial blast, came home and sat in his favorite chair like nothing had happened. His skin was falling off, but he just smiled at her. The military broadcast stopped yesterday. The last transmission was just someone screaming about shadows that moved on their own, before the signal cut out completely. I heard that same laugh again in the background. The generators are failing, and the emergency lights are getting dim. But I'm starting to think the darkness might be safer, because now, when I look down the hall towards Studio B, I can see small footprints in the dust. They lead me to my door, and they're getting closer. The generators died at 3:47 a.m. I know because I was staring at the digital clock when it happened, watching those red numbers flick and fade to black. The silence that followed was deafening. For 6 days I've had the constant hum of machinery as my companion. Now there was nothing. Nothing except the sound of someone humming, "You Are My Sunshine," from somewhere in the darkness. It was Katie's favorite song. I used to sing it to her every night before bed, even after the divorce, when our time together became measured in weekends and phone calls. The humming was coming from the break room, where I'd set up my makeshift bed. I knew I shouldn't follow it. But what kind of father would I be if I didn't? The emergency lights in the hallway flickered weakly, running on their last backup batteries. The temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. The humming grew louder as I approached the break room, and beneath it, I could hear the soft scraping of chair legs against linoleum. When I reached the doorway, the humming stopped. Katie was sitting at the table, her back to me. That purple backpack I brought her still strapped to her shoulders. My flashlight beam trembled as I called out her name. She turned around, and I dropped the flashlight. I'm writing this now from the supply closet. I barricaded the door with everything I could find. The thing in the break room. It looked like Katie, but only in the way that a reflection in broken glass looks like you. All the pieces were there, but they were wrong, twisted. And its eyes. Jesus, its eyes. The worst part? I'm not alone in here. There's something breathing in the dark with me. I can feel it getting closer. The air is thick with radiation. My Geiger counter is crackling like burning wood. It's starting to hum again. I need to tell you something about that first night when the bombs fell. Something I haven't admitted to anyone, not even myself. I could have driven to Katie's. I had time before the fallout started, but I was afraid. I convinced myself the station was safer, that I could help more people from here. The truth is, I'm just a coward. Now I know what the footprints in the dust mean, what all this means. They're not just random victims of radiation showing up at people's doors. They're here for a reason. They're here for the ones we left behind. The humming is right outside the closet door. The handle is turning. Katie, baby, I'm so sorry I didn't come for you. Daddy's sorry. I survived the night in the supply closet, but I wish I hadn't. When the door finally opened, there was nothing there. No Katie, no monster. Just empty darkness and the ever-present clicking of my Geiger counter. But something had changed. The walls of the station. They're different now. Wrong. Like they're breathing. I found messages carved into the supply closet walls. Hundreds of them. Overlapping each other. They weren't there before. Some in languages I don't recognize. They all seem to be saying the same thing. Come home. The emergency broadcast system suddenly kicked back on this morning, even though there's no power, no generators, nothing that could possibly be powering it. Instead of the usual alert tone, it's playing recordings of my old radio shows, all the times I talked about Katie on air, all the birthdays I missed because I was working, all the promises I broke. But between the recordings, there are voices, hundreds of voices, whispering coordinates, the same coordinates that were broadcast the night of the bombs. When I map them out, they form a pattern, a spiral. And the station? The station is at the center. I tried to leave, to make a run for it, but the front doors won't open anymore. The windows show nothing but static, like an old TV screen. The only clear view is from the broadcast booth, and I wish to God I hadn't looked. The city isn't there anymore. Where buildings should be, there's just a vast field of crosses made of shadow, stretching to the horizon. They're moving, swaying without wind. And between them, small figures with backpacks are walking through the ash, all heading this way. The radiation levels are impossible now. The Geiger counter just shows infinity. I should be dead. And maybe I am. I found a note in my pocket that I know I didn't write. It's in Katie's handwriting, but the letters are backwards, like they were written from the other side of the paper. Daddy, why did you leave us out there? We're all coming to the station now. Everyone who was left behind. Everyone who waited for help that never came. We just wanted to go home. Don't you want to go home, Daddy? The walls are definitely breathing now. The equipment in the broadcast booth keeps turning itself on, playing fragments of that last day. I can hear footsteps again, but this time it's not just Katie. It sounds like hundreds of feet, moving in unison, getting closer. They're in the building. The stairs are full of shadows. I think it's time to go home. They found me in the broadcast booth. I don't know why I'm still alive. Maybe that's not the right word anymore. Alive. There were hundreds of them. Children clutching backpacks and teddy bears. Parents still in their business suits. Elderly people in hospital gowns. All of them wrong in ways that hurt to look at. Like someone had tried to draw people from memory, but kept making mistakes. They didn't touch me. They just stood there, watching. Their shadows didn't match their bodies. Too long and too twisted. Moving when they were still. And in the back of the crowd, I saw Katie. But not just one Katie. Dozens of her. Each one slightly different. Like versions from parallel universes where I made different choices. Where I failed her in different ways. The Katies spoke in unison. Show them, Daddy. Show them what you saw. My hands moved on their own, turning on the broadcasting equipment. The dials all spun to impossible frequencies, numbers that shouldn't exist. Static filled the room. But underneath it, I could hear voices. Millions of voices. All overlapping. Why didn't you come? We waited. Help never came. You left us. The radiation meter exploded, showering the booth with glass and sparks. But in those sparks, I saw it. The truth. What really happened that night. The bombs weren't bombs at all. I've been piecing it together. The coordinates, the spiral pattern, the impossible readings. They weren't launching sites. They were arrival points. That light in the horizon wasn't a nuclear blast. It was something opening. Something that had been waiting for us to destroy ourselves enough to let them in. The radiation isn't radiation at all. It's more like bleed through. Reality breaking down where they entered our world. And now they're using our guilt to reshape everything. Our abandoned loved ones are just the templates they're using to take form. To make us accept them. To make us want to go home. The shadows are worse now. They're not even pretending to be attached to anything anymore. They're just shapes. Hungry shapes. And they're spreading out from the station, using our broadcast signals to reach everyone else who left someone behind. The Katies are showing me things. Memories. But not just mine. Everyone's memories. Every abandoned child. Every forgotten parent. Every broken promise. They're all here. All broadcasting out into the static. The walls of the station are gone. We're suspended in something that looks like the space between TV channels now. The other stations are out there in the darkness, glowing like dying stars, all broadcasting the same signals, all calling people home. My hands are changing as I write this, becoming less real, more like a signal, like static. They say everyone I let down is waiting for me at home. They say home isn't a place anymore. It's a frequency. The frequency is a hungry thing. It eats memories, broadcasts them like reruns of old shows, and then eats those too. I've watched my life with Katie play out 1,000 times now, each viewing more distorted than the last. Sometimes she's older, sometimes she's younger, sometimes she was never born at all. And those are the worst versions because they feel the most true. The other survivors who took shelter in a nearby building are being drawn to the station now. I can see them walking through the static space, their bodies flickering like bad reception. They all have the same look in their eyes. The look of people who left someone behind. I understand now why they chose a radio station, why they chose me. Broadcasting isn't just about sending signals. It's about reaching into empty spaces and filling them with something. That's what they are. Empty spaces trying to fill themselves with us. The Katies taught me how to read the static. It's like a language once you know how to listen. Every burst of white noise is a confession. Every pop and crackle is someone begging for forgiveness. The entire electromagnetic spectrum is screaming. One of the other GJs who used to work here, Mike, showed up an hour ago. Or where it used to be Mike. He's more television snow than person now. But he told me something important before his face became static. They've been here before. Every mass extinction. Every civilization that disappeared without a trace. They don't destroy worlds. They change channels. The shadows are getting impatient. They want me to help them broadcast the final signal. The one that will tune every survivor to their frequency. They keep showing me what they call home. A place where all possible versions of every moment exist simultaneously. Where I can be with every version of Katie, even the ones that never existed. But I can still hear the real broadcasts cutting through sometimes. Military channels, other survivors, people still fighting. They don't know what they're fighting against. How do you fight a signal? The Katies say I don't have a choice anymore. That once you've been behind the static, you can't change the channel back. But they're wrong. I found another frequency. It's harder to tune into. It hurts, like pressing on a bruise. But it's real and raw, the opposite of static. It's silence. True silence. The kind that comes before a broadcast. The kind that just might save what's left of humanity. But reaching it will cost everything. All my memories of Katie. All my guilt. All of me. The shadows are scratching at the booth now. They know what I'm planning. I don't have much time. If you're receiving this, It means I succeeded. Or maybe I failed. The difference doesn't matter anymore because I don't exist enough to know the difference. The silence frequency was never meant to be a weapon. It was a gift from the last civilization they consumed. A way to unmake their signal. But using it means unmaking yourself too. Becoming a different kind of empty space. The kind they can't fill. The Katies tried to stop me. All of them. They showed me every possible happy ending. Every version of reality where I made it to her mother's house that night. Where I saved her. Where we lived. But that's the thing about radio, eventually. Every song has to end. The hardest part wasn't finding the courage to broadcast the silence. It was remembering what Katie really looked like. One last time. Before letting that memory go. Not the twisted versions they created, but my real daughter. The way she smiled. The sound of her laugh. The feel of her hand in mine. I'm broadcasting this final message across all frequencies as the silence builds. To anyone still out there, still human enough to receive it. When the static comes for you, showing you everything you lost, everyone you failed, don't look away. Don't try to tune it out. Face it and accept it, and then let it go. Because that's what they don't understand about us, about humanity. We're not just about the sum of our memories, our guilt, our failures. We're the space between stations, the pause between songs, the moment before we press play. The silence is almost here now. I can feel myself becoming something else. Not static, not signal, and not memory. The Katies are screaming, their forms dissolving into television snow. The shadows are retreating, pulling back into dimensions they understand. The things that came through disguised as nuclear fire are being unmade by something more powerful than their frequencies. The absence of signal, the absence of guilt, and the absence of self. To Katie, my real Katie. If you're somehow still out there, I love you. Not the memory of you. Not the guilt of leaving you. Just you. To anyone receiving this, remember us. Remember that when the static came for humanity, we chose silence. We chose emptiness. We chose to unmake ourselves to save what was left. And if something is still broadcasting after today, it isn't us. Don't tune in. Don't listen to its promises. Don't let it show you what you've lost. Change the channel. Turn off the radio. Embrace the silence. This is signing off for the last time. Forever. I never thought I'd be writing this on Reddit, but I need to document what's happening here in Miller's Creek before our cell phone service gives out completely. We're already down to one bar, and the landlines went dead yesterday. If anyone sees this, please send help. We're about 4 hours north of Spokane, population 847. Or at least, that was the count before people started dying. It began 3 days ago with Old Man Jenkins's cow. I was driving home from my shift at the lumber mill when I spotted the carcass in his field. The thing was torn apart like I'd never seen before. Not like a wolf or mountain lion attack. The rib cage was completely exposed, but there wasn't much blood. It looked picked clean. Jenkins himself was odd when I stopped by to tell him. His usual chatty demeanor was gone, replaced by a blank stare and mumbled words. He had a nasty gash in his arm that he said he had got from barbed wire, but it looked more like a bite mark to me. I should have noticed how pale he was, how his skin had grayish tinge, but who expects worse, you know? The next morning, Jenkins wasn't at May's diner for his usual breakfast. May said he hadn't called to cancel his standing order of black coffee and wheat toast, something he hadn't missed in 15 years. Sheriff Cooper went to check on him, and hasn't been seen since. That's when the screaming started. I was at the warehouse store when we heard it, this horrible guttural shriek from the direction of the post office. Through the window, I saw Sarah Palmer, our mail carrier, running down Main Street. Behind her was... God, I still can't believe what I saw. It was Jenkins, but not Jenkins. His jaw was hanging at an impossible angle, and it was moving wrong, like a marionette with tangled strings. The bite on his arm had turned black. Sarah didn't make it to the hardware store. I'm writing this from my basement now. I can hear them shuffling around outside. Jenkins, Sarah, the sheriff, and at least a dozen others. The radio's nothing but static, and the highway's been blocked by abandoned cars since yesterday. Cell phones are barely working, and the internet's spotty at best. I haven't been able to reach my sister in Seattle. The infection, or whatever it is, spreads fast. A bite is all it takes, and you've got about 6 hours before the fever hits. Then the confusion sets in, followed by aggression. Finally, the hunger. Always the hunger. Mayor Stevens tried to call the state police yesterday, but I don't think the message got through. The town's been effectively cut off since the late winter storm took out the bridge on Route 12 last week. Repairs were supposed to start Monday. Now I'm wondering if help will ever come. I've got enough supplies down here for maybe 2 weeks. The gun safe is secure, and I have my hunting rifle with plenty of ammo. Through the small basement window, I can see some of my neighbors' houses. Most are dark now. The Henderson's place has been burning since this morning. No fire trucks came. The shuffling outside is getting louder. They know I'm here. They always know. Something about them. They can sense the living. I've watched them ignore the dead animals in the street, but turn their heads in unison when Mrs. Peterson's cat moved in a window. I try to post updates if I can, but the connection's getting worse. If anyone sees this, please. We need help in Miller's Creek, and if you're reading this from somewhere else, watch the people around you carefully. Watch for the signs I missed. The pale skin, the vacant stares, the unexplained wounds. And whatever you do, don't let them bite you. I have to go now. Something's scratching at my basement door. Update to follow. It's been 36 hours since my last post. My phone says it's 3:47 a.m., but I'm not sure if that's right anymore. The power grid failed last night, and I've been running on my emergency generator. I have to be quick. The noise attracts them, and I can only run it for short bursts to charge my phone. The scratching at my basement door stopped eventually, but only because they found easier prey. I heard the screams from the Chen family next door around midnight. Their teenage son had been hiding in his treehouse. I saw the whole thing through my window. He tried to make a run for their car, but they caught him halfway across the yard. I had to shut my eyes, but I couldn't block out the sounds. There's something else you need to know about these things. They're learning. Yesterday morning, they would just shamble around, bumping into walls and cars. Now they're different. I watched Old Man Jenkins figure out how to use a rock to break through the Petersons' living room window. They're problem solving, adapting. The worst part? They remember things. Earlier today, I saw Sarah Palmer's remains, trying to sort through mail on the ground, mimicking her old route, and Sheriff Cooper's body keeps returning to his usual parking spot behind the diner, as if he's still watching for speeders on Main Street. It's like some horrible echo of who they used to be. I made radio contact with someone this morning. Derek, from the ranger station up on Mount Collins. He says the Forest Service roads are all blocked by snow from last week's storm. The spring thaw was supposed to clear them, but now. He also mentioned seeing strange lights in the sky last night, hovering over the old mining quarry. I told him he was being paranoid, but after what I've seen, I'm not sure of anything anymore. I had to leave my basement for supplies today. The shuffle-drag sound of their footsteps had grown distant, so I risked a run to Gorman's Market 2 blocks away. The store was a mess, but I managed to find some canned food and water. That's when I saw little Emma Davis. She was my daughter's best friend. They used to have sleepovers every weekend before the divorce, before my ex took our Katie to Portland. Emma was just standing there in the cereal aisle, her princess backpack still on, dried blood caking her blonde hair. When she turned, God, her eyes. They were clouded over, but somehow aware. She recognized me. She said my name, or tried to. The sound that came out wasn't human. I ran, and I'm not proud of it. But here's the thing that really keeps me awake. On my way back, I saw tracks in the mud near the quarry. They weren't human tracks, or animal tracks, or even whatever these things are called, tracks. They were perfect circles, about 3 feet in diameter, evenly spaced like something had walked through them on stilts. They led straight to the water treatment plant. The water. Come to think of it, everything started the day after the maintenance on the main water line. Jenkins's farm was the first to get the new connection. My throat feels dry just thinking about it. But I haven't touched tap water since this started. Been using bottled water for my emergency kit. Maybe that's why. Hold on. Something's happening outside. There's a light, like the one Derek described, moving over the town. It's too steady to be a helicopter, too low to be a plane. And the infected. They're all turning to watch it, moving together like they share one mind. Even Emma, who I can see through my neighbor's broken window, is standing perfectly still, face turned upward. The generator's about to die, and I don't dare run it again with that thing up there. I'll try to post again if anyone sees this, destroy the samples. I repeat, destroy the samples. My hands are shaking as I type this. The bite on my leg is starting to turn gray, and I can feel the fever setting in. I don't have much time, but people need to know what happened in Miller's Creek. After my last post, the light descended on the water treatment plant. It wasn't a UFO like I'd feared. It was worse. It was one of ours. A black helicopter with no markings, but I recognized the insignia on the hazmat suits. Monarch Pharmaceutical Solutions, the same company that won the contract to modernize our water treatment system 2 months ago. I watched from my basement window as they collected samples, not from the infected, but from the water supply. They knew exactly where to look. This wasn't an accident. We were the test site. I found the documentation. After I lost internet connection, I got desperate and broke into the water treatment plant through the maintenance tunnel. Most of the infected had followed the helicopter to the quarry, so the streets were clearer. Inside the plant, I discovered files left behind by the maintenance crew. Classified reports about Project Renaissance, an experimental compound designed to accelerate cellular regeneration. They were testing it here, in our water supply. Small town, isolated location, controllable variables. But something went wrong. The compound didn't just regenerate cells, it reanimated them after death. And it kept some fragment of memory intact, trapped in rotting flesh that refused to decay. Those weren't mindless zombies out there. They were our friends and neighbors, conscious but unable to stop their bodies from hunting the living. I took the photos of everything with my phone. I'm attaching them to this post. The GPS coordinates of the testing sites are included. Miller's Creek isn't the only town they're targeting. There are others marked for treatment once they perfect the formula. Places just like us. Small, isolated, expendable. The helicopter came back an hour ago. They're not here to save us. They're here to clean up their mess. I can hear explosions from the direction of Main Street. The air smells like chemicals. Sarah Palmer's infected form found me in the treatment plant. She was still wearing her mail carrier's uniform. Still had her mailbag. Even with her jaw missing, she tried to hand me a letter before the hunger took over. The bite isn't deep, but it doesn't need to be. I've barricaded myself in the plant's control room. Outside, I can see hazmat teams setting up incendiary devices. They're gonna burn Miller's Creek to the ground. Blame it on a forest fire. Clean, simple, no evidence. But they didn't get the samples I took. While they were setting up their equipment, I managed to mail them out. Multiple packages, different destinations. Sarah's last delivery, Even in death, she did her job. The fever is getting worse. My vision's blurring, but I can still hear them. The infected, my neighbors, my friends, they're screaming. Not with hunger anymore, but with pain. The chemicals are starting to work. To whoever finds these packages, expose them. Shows the world what they did to us. And to anyone living in a small town that seems too perfect, too quiet, check your water. Check your... God, the pain. I can feel it changing me. The hunger. I understand now. We stay conscious. We feel everything. We just can't... stop. I hear them breaking the door down. I don't have much time left. Remember Miller's Creek. Remember what they did to us. And whatever you do, don't drink the water. We thought it was just another season of hardship, like so many before. Life in our village had always been simple, even harsh, but it was the only life we knew. The year was 1642, though few of us kept track. We toiled on land that wasn't ours, offering crops and service to Lord Davenham, the local noble who ruled from his stone manor up the hill. It had been a cold spring, with strange mists that clung to the fields longer than usual. The church bells rang more often for the dead than the living. Rumors of a strange sickness reached us from the neighboring towns, but we dismissed them as talk from travelers. There was always talk of something. War in distant lands, disease in the cities, and of course, witches. Superstition ran deep here, stronger than reason. If the cows stopped giving milk or a child fell ill, it was said to be the work of a hex or evil eye. The priest, Father Matthias, warned us to pray harder, to stay vigilant against sin and temptation. Most listened, kneeling in the old stone church with its damp walls and flickering candles. But some of us couldn't help but wonder if our misfortunes came from something darker, something lurking beyond the borders of what we understood. Then came the comet. It streaked across the sky one cold night, brighter than anything we'd ever seen. We all watched it in silence, its tail dragging like a wound across the heavens. To some, it was a sign of the end times. Others took it as an omen of war. I didn't know what to make of it. None of us really did, but we were afraid. The first signs of sickness were subtle. Old Marjorie, who lived on the edge of the village, fell ill first. She was frail to begin with, always muttering about spirits and leaving charms by her door to ward off bad luck. When she stopped coming to the market, no one thought much of it. A cold, they said, or a fever. It wasn't until her son, Thomas, found her walking aimlessly in the fields one night, her eyes vacant, her skin cold and gray, that the whispers began. By the time Father Matthias went to see her, it was too late. Marjorie was dead, but not at rest. Thomas swore she had tried to bite him before she had to be held down and tied to her bed. No one believed him until they saw her with their own eyes. Her mouth gaped open, black liquid seeping from her lips. The marks of her struggle were on her wrists, where the ropes cut deep, but still she moved. I was there, standing in the doorway with the others, frozen in disbelief. Father Matthias called it possession. He read from his Bible, dousing her with holy water. It did nothing. She thrashed against the restraints, her body twisting in ways that no living person could. That's when we knew something was terribly wrong. She wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, others fell sick, then rose again. It spread slowly at first, but it was enough to put fear in all of us. People started to lock their doors at night, whispering prayers or having charms above their beds. Some blamed the comet, others the witches they believed hid among us. But deep down, we all knew this was something worse than anything we'd ever imagined. Something had come to our village, something beyond reason or faith. The dead were not staying dead, and whatever this was, it was only the beginning. The days after Marjorie's death blurred into a haze of fear and confusion. We stopped going about our usual tasks. No one tended the fields, and the market stalls stood empty. Everyone stayed in their homes, as if our wooden doors and flimsy shutters could keep the sickness at bay. Every cough, every sniffle made my heart race. We tried to convince ourselves it was just a fever, the kind that had come before. But deep down, we knew better. Thomas barricaded himself in the cottage after what happened with his mother. We didn't see him again, and no one was brave enough to check on him. Father Matthias went to Lord Davenham to ask for help, but the nobleman dismissed it as village hysteria. "I've seen plague before," the Lord said, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is no different. You peasants always think the world is ending." But this was different. We all knew it. The infection didn't behave like any sickness we'd ever seen. It didn't just kill. It transformed. Those who fell ill and died didn't stay in their graves. The first time we saw it, we thought it was some cruel trick of nature. Agnes, the blacksmith's wife, had died one evening, her body ravaged by the strange fever that had taken Marjorie. Her husband, Olwyn, dug her grave himself, weeping as he laid her to rest in the churchyard. But that night, she came back. I was there. A group of us had gathered in the church to keep vigil, hoping that staying close to the altar might keep the sickness away. The air inside was thick with incense and whispered prayers. That's when we heard it. The sound of something dragging against the stone. At first, we thought it was the wind, but the noise grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the heavy wooden doors. When we opened them, we saw her, Agnes, her eyes dull and lifeless, her body covered in dirt from the grave. She moved in a slow, shuffling way, her arms outstretched, fingers clawing at the air. Olwyn screamed when he saw her, a sound I will never forget. He rushed to her, but Father Matthias held him back. "She's not your wife anymore," the priest said, his voice shaking. Agnes wasn't the only one. That night, others rose. Those who had died over the past few days. Old Jeb, the miller's son, a traveling merchant who'd been staying at the inn, were all walking again. They didn't speak, didn't seem to recognize any of us. They were hollow, driven by something dark and unnatural, and they were hungry. We tried to keep them out, but our defenses were laughable. The church doors couldn't hold forever. I saw Father Matthias clutch his crucifix so tightly that his knuckles went white. But faith alone wasn't going to save us. When the dead finally broke through, we had no choice but to flee. I ran with the others, stumbling through the darkness, our torches flickering against the light. Some headed for the woods, thinking they could outrun the dead. I don't know if they ever made it. Others, like me, took refuge in whatever house we could find. I ended up in old widow Tansley's cottage, along with a handful of others. My neighbor Edith, Olwyn, and a couple of the village boys. We sat in silence, listening to the distant moans and the pounding of the doors, hoping that ours wouldn't be next. Edith clutched her rosary, muttering prayers under her breath. Olwyn just stared at the floor, his face pale and hollow. We didn't sleep that night, and when dawn came, it brought no comfort. The village was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes after something terrible has swept through. We ventured out cautiously, stepping over broken doors and smashed windows. The church was empty now, the dead having moved on, but the signs of their passage were everywhere. Blood, broken furniture, and the eerie silence of a village abandoned by life. That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't just our village's problem. If the dead had risen here, they could rise anywhere. The sickness, whatever it was spreading, and it would continue to spread until there was no one left to infect. I stood in the middle of the village square, looking at the faces of the few survivors who had gathered. "What now?" one of the boys asks, his voice small and afraid. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We had no choice but to prepare. For what? We weren't sure. But we knew one thing. Whatever had come to life in the bodies of our neighbors and loved ones was not going to stop, and we were next if we didn't act quickly. The village that morning was unrecognizable. The streets, once filled with the sounds of cattle and chatter, were empty. Doors hung off their hinges, and the few remaining animals roamed free, bleating and bellowing with no one to tend them. A thick, acrid smell lingered in the air. Death, mixed with smoke from the scattered fires. It felt as if we had stepped into a nightmare. Olwen was the first to speak. "We need to bury them," he muttered, his voice flat and hollow. I didn't know whether he was talking about Agnes or the others, but his eyes had a distant look, as if the reality of the past days hadn't fully settled in. "It's what the Lord would want." Edith shook her head. "Bury them? Are you mad? They'll just crawl back out again. You saw what happened last night." Her hands were still trembling, the rosary beads twisted between her fingers. She was right. The graves weren't holding them anymore. Whatever dark force had taken hold of the dead didn't respect the rites we performed, the prayers we said, or the rituals that once offered comfort. Father Matthias had told us the soul left the body after death, but now we saw bodies moving without souls. It was an abomination. "We can't just leave them to wander," I said, breaking the heavy silence. "We've seen what they're capable of. If we don't deal with this, they'll come for us again. And next time, we won't be so lucky." Edith and the others nodded reluctantly. Even Olwen, though lost in his grief, seemed to understand. We had to act, but the question was how. "We can burn them," one of the boys suggested, his voice uncertain. "The smoke will take them to heaven." It sounded like something his mother had told him when he was young, a comforting lie to explain the funerals we'd held in the past. I didn't know if burning the bodies would do anything, but it seemed like the only way to stop them from rising again. Fire had always been feared and respected. It was the ultimate purifier. But the thought of setting fire to the bodies of people we'd known, people we had loved, was horrifying. Still, we didn't have much choice. The day passed in a grim haze. We gathered the bodies, careful not to touch them directly, using cloths and wooden poles to move them. Some were half rotted already, their skin pulling away from the bone, faces twisted into grotesque masks of what they once were. Agnes was among them, her mouth still gaping, her fingers bent into claws. Olwen refused to look at her as he loaded her into the cart. By late afternoon, we had collected the bodies in a pile just beyond the village, near the woods where we used to gather firewood. The air was heavy, the sky overcast, as though the world itself was mourning. Father Matthias stood beside the pile, his face pale and drawn. He held his Bible in one hand, but I could see his faith was wavering. I wondered if he still believed his words would be heard by a God who seemed to have abandoned us. He said the rites anyway, his voice shaking with each line. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust." His words were hollow, as if he didn't believe them any more than we did. We doused the bodies in oil and kindling, and set them alight. The fire caught quickly, roaring to life with an almost unnatural fervor. The smell was unbearable. Burning flesh, smoke, and something else. Something foul that made my stomach churn. We stood in a circle around the pyre, watching in silence as the flames consumed the dead. There were no tears left to cry, just a bone-deep weariness. As the bodies turned to ash, I couldn't help but wonder if this was truly the end for them. The flames felt final, but nothing in this cursed place seemed certain anymore. That night, the village was quieter than it had been in days. The dead were gone, at least for now, and those of us who remained huddled in whatever shelter we could find. Some gathered in the church, seeking the comfort of walls that felt safe, while others, myself included, returned to our homes, too exhausted to care if the doors would hold another night. I sat in my small cottage, the door barred with whatever I could find. My hands were raw from the day's work, but sleep wouldn't come. The shadows outside felt alive, and every creak in the walls sent a chill down my spine. We had made it through another day, but I knew it was far from over. The sickness wasn't gone. It was out there, waiting, spreading. And as long as it was, none of us were safe. The next morning, Father Matthias called for a meeting. The survivors, what few of us were there, gathered in the church. He stood at the front, his eyes sunken in red. "We must leave," he said. "This village is cursed. We cannot stay here and expect to survive." Edith stood up, her face pale. "Where would we go, Father? The sickness is everywhere. You've seen it. We're not the only ones." He sighed heavily, clutching his cross. "There is a place, far to the north, a monastery. I've heard rumors it's untouched, that the brothers there have knowledge, something ancient, something powerful. It's a long journey, but it may be our only hope." I looked around the room, at the faces of the people I had known my whole life, now gaunt with the fear and grief. None of us wanted to leave, but what choice did we have? The dead were no longer bound by the earth, and neither could we be. We had to make a decision: to stay here and die, or to journey into the unknown in search of something, anything, that could save us. I knew what we had to do. "We leave at first light," I said, standing. "Whoever is coming with me, be ready." The weight of my words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the church. Father Matthias bowed his head, murmuring a quiet prayer. One by one, the others began to nod, their faces grim but resolute. We all understood that staying here meant certain death. Whatever hope lay to the north was better than waiting for the sickness to claim us. Edith was the first to speak. "I'll go," she said softly, though her hands trembled as she gripped her rosary. "If there's a chance, any chance, we have to take it." Olwen remained seated, staring at the ground. His grief for Agnes seemed to have drained all the fight from him. He was a broken man. "Olwen," I called gently, stepping closer to him. "We need you. You're the strongest among us. We can't make this journey without you." For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then, with a deep sigh, he lifted his head. "I'll come," he muttered, his voice flat. "But don't expect me to care if any of you don't make it." His words were harsh, but I knew it was the pain speaking. He had lost everything. That night, we made our preparations. There wasn't much to take. Some stale bread, dried meat, whatever water we could carry. Edith gathered herbs and poultices, things she'd learned from the village healer before she had died. Father Matthias insisted on bringing his Bible and a small vial of holy water, though I wasn't sure how much protection that would give us. As for me, I packed light. Just a knife, some flint, and a cloak for the cold. The journey north would be long, and I didn't want to be weighed down by more than I needed. The air was tense as we worked. Everyone moved with quiet purpose, though none of us could shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far worse. The dead had risen, and it was only a matter of time before they found us again. The village felt like a ghost town now, with so many houses empty and silent. The dead burned to ash, and the living gone or hidden. I stood at the edge of the village as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale, ghostly glow over the fields. The mist was thick again, swirling like smoke through the trees. Edith, Olwyn, and a handful of others gathered behind me. They were fewer than I had hoped, perhaps a dozen in all, including Father Matthias. Some had chosen to stay behind, either out of fear or the stubborn belief that the village could still be saved. I knew better. The village was lost. "Ready?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. They nodded, some with more conviction than others. We had no choice but to press on. As we started walking, the village disappeared behind us, swallowed by the mist. The path north was unfamiliar, winding through dense forests and over rough hills. The road, if you could call it that, was little more than a dirt trail, narrow and overgrown in places. I led the group in silence, every sound around us amplified by the eerie quiet. Each snap of a twig, each rustle of leaves. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Hours passed, and still the feeling of being watched lingered. I glanced back from time to time, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The dead moved slowly, yes, but they were relentless. I had seen that with my own eyes. I didn't want to think about how far the infection had spread, how many others had fallen and risen again in other villages, other towns. Was there even a safe place left to reach? As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and orange, we stopped by a small stream to rest. Father Matthias knelt by the water's edge, cupping his hands to drink. Edith checked her herbs, muttering to herself about what little she could do if anyone fell ill. Olwyn sat apart from the group, sharpening his knife on a stone, his eyes distant. I leaned against the tree, watching the shadows grow longer. That uneasy feeling still hadn't left me. There was something in the air. Something wrong. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was like the world had shifted. I could feel it in my bones. "Do you think the monastery is real?" one of the boys asked, his voice quiet as he sat beside me. He was barely 17, a farmhand who had joined us out of desperation, not hope. His name was Peter. I remembered now, though I hadn't spoken to him much. "I don't know," I admitted, keeping my gaze on the darkening forest. "We have to believe in something. If we don't, what else is there?" He nodded, though his expression was uncertain. I don't understand how this happened. One day, everything was normal. Now, this. He gestured vaguely at the world around us, as if words weren't enough to describe the horrors we'd seen. "Neither do I said, my voice low. "But we have to keep going." Before he could respond, Olwyn stood suddenly, his eyes fixed on something behind the trees. "Quiet!" he hissed. We all froze. The air felt thicker, charged with tension. For a moment, all I could hear was the rushing water of the stream and the wind rustling the leaves. Then I heard it. A faint sound, distant but unmistakable. The low, guttural moan of something that should not be walking. The dead had found us. "Move!" I shouted, grabbing my pack and slinging it over my shoulder. "Now!" Panic surged through the group as we scrambled to our feet, but we had no time to organize. The sound of the dead grew closer, the unmistakable shuffle of their footsteps blending with their low, hungry growls. We plunged into the trees, hoping the thick forest would slow them down. Branches snapped underfoot, the underbrush tearing at our legs as we ran. Behind me, I could hear Peter panting, his breath ragged with fear. I couldn't afford to look back. I knew that if I did, I would see them. Gray, rotting figures, relentless in their pursuit. We ran until our legs burned and our lungs ached, the forest growing darker with each passing moment. But no matter how fast we moved, the sound of the dead was always just behind us, and I knew, deep in my gut, that we couldn't keep running forever. The forest closed in around us, branches clawing at our clothes as we ran through the thickening darkness. I could hear the others stumbling behind me, gasping for breath, but none of us dared to stop. Every few moments, that terrible, wet moan of the dead seemed closer, as if the forest itself were filled with their creeping forms. We had no plan, just run. That was all we could do. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. They would catch us eventually. Peter, who had been running just behind me, suddenly cried out. I turned to see him sprawled on the ground, his foot tangled in a twisted root. He struggled to free himself, but the panic in his eyes told me everything. He was trapped. I skidded to a stop and rushed back to him. "Hold on!" I yelled, dropping to my knees beside him, frantically pulling at the root. Edith was there in an instant, trying to help. But Peter's leg was stuck deep. The gnarled root twisted tightly around his ankle. "Leave me," he gasped, his voice filled with desperation. "They're coming." I shook my head, teeth clenched. "No one's getting left behind," I growled, tugging harder. My hands were raw. Dirt caked upon my nails as I pulled and clawed at the root. I could feel the vibrations of the ground as the dead approached. The sound of their groans was growing louder, closer. Finally, with a sickening snap, the root gave way. Peter cried out as his leg came free, and pulled him to his feet. He was limping, but still able to move. "Go!" I shouted, moving him forward. We stumbled through the trees, hearts pounding. The dead were nearly upon us. I could see them moving through the shadows, their twisted forms barely visible in the gloom. "Here!" Father Matthias's voice came from ahead. I followed the sound, breaking through the trees in a small clearing, in the center of what was a dilapidated stone chapel, barely visible in the fading light. The roof sagged, and vines crawled up its crumbling walls, but it was something, some place to shelter, if only for a moment. "Get inside!" I shouted, pushing Peter towards the door. Edith and Alwyn were already inside, and I could hear the others scrambling to follow. I was the last to enter, slamming the heavy door shut behind me. Alwyn immediately began piling debris and furniture against it, anything we could find to reinforce the old, brittle door. The dead pounded against the door outside, their fists thudding dully against the stone walls. But for the moment, we were all right. Inside, the chapel was a ruin. Broken pews and cracked stone covered the floor, and what little light remained filtered in through the shattered stained glass. Dust filled the air, and a heavy silence settled over us as we caught our breath. Peter leaned against the wall, clutching his injured leg. Edith knelt beside him, inspecting the damage. "It's not broken," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You'll be all right, but you won't be able to run for a while." Peter nodded weakly, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. "We can't stay here long," I said, standing near the door. "This place won't hold them for long, and we've got a long way to go." Father Matthias, who had been standing near the altar, turned toward us, his face drawn. "We need a plan," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "The dead aren't going to stop. They'll follow us wherever we go, unless we find a way to stop them." I glanced around at the others, their faces a mix of fear and exhaustion. "How?" I asked. "What could possibly stop them? We've burned them, buried them. Nothing works." Father Matthias paused, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his Bible. "There are old stories," he said quietly, his eyes distant. "Things were once whispered among the priests in the monasteries. Dark magic, curses, things we don't speak of. But if the dead are walking, then maybe it's one of those things that's causing this." I stared at him, my mind racing. "You think this is some kind of curse?" He nodded slowly, I don't know for certain, but I believe the monastery to the north may hold answers. The brothers there have studied the old texts. They might know what this is and how to stop it. The others exchange uneasy glances, but I could see the flicker of hope in their eyes. We had nothing else to cling to. Then we go north, I said firmly. At first light, we keep moving. If there's even a chance they know how to stop this, we have to try. The others nodded. Though fear still hung in the air, we were alive. For now. But the dead were relentless, and every hour we stayed here, they grew closer. The pounding against the chapel walls hadn't stopped, though. It had quieted. They were waiting for us to make a mistake. I sat down against the cold stone wall, exhaustion finally catching up with me. My body ached, my thoughts spun everything we had seen and done. But I couldn't let myself rest long. The dead didn't tire, and they didn't wait. Tomorrow we would continue north. We had no choice but to keep moving. No choice but to search for whatever hope the monastery held. For now, we waited, surrounded by shadows, praying that the dawn would bring us something other than death. We huddled together in the cold, damp chapel as night pressed in. The dead were still outside, their groans faint but ever present. Sleep was impossible, but we tried to rest. Edith sat beside Peter, wrapping his injured leg with some cloth we had managed to scavenge. His face was pale and drawn, though he was silent, biting back the pain. Olwen sat by the door, his knife glinting in the low light as he sharpened it over and over. The rasp of metal and stone, the only sound besides the occasional distant thud from outside. Father Matthias hadn't moved from the altar. He was deep in thought, or maybe prayer. I wasn't sure anymore. The faith that had once seemed so steady in him had been shaken. I could see it in his eyes, the way his hands trembled when he reached for his Bible. His words about dark magic and curses still echoed in my mind. This world had always been filled with superstition, but this was different. The dead rising from their graves, attacking the living, was no mere tale to frighten children. I stood and walked over to the small, shattered window. The night outside was pitch black, save for the pale silver of the moon. The forest beyond the clearing was still. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing except for the occasional moan from the dead. What do you think we'll find at the monastery? Edith's voice broke the silence. She was still tending to Peter, but her eyes were on me now, questioning. Do you really believe they'll know what's causing this? I didn't have an answer. I stared at the crumbling stone walls, feeling the weight of our situation pressing down on me. I don't know, I said honestly. But Father Matthias seems to think they might. And if there's even a chance, they do. We can't afford not to try. Edith nodded, though I could see the doubt in her eyes. The stories. The old ones about curses and dark magic. I never thought they were real. She glanced toward Father Matthias, who remained lost in his silent contemplation. I always thought the church would protect us from anything like this. So did I admitted. But if this plague is truly unnatural, then maybe it's something we've never faced before. Something beyond the church's teachings. Olwen let out a sharp laugh, bitter and humorless. The church can't save us. It hasn't so far. He didn't look up from his knife as he spoke. Faith is all well and good when you're safe in your home, but it doesn't stop the dead from clawing their way back from the grave. I couldn't argue with him. Faith hadn't stopped the sickness from spreading, or the dead from rising. And yet, what else did we have? We were clinging on to the hope that somewhere, someone knew how to end this nightmare. That there was a cure, or a spell, or something that could put the dead back in their graves for good. We're going to leave first thing in the morning, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Rest while you can. The hours dragged on, each minute slower than the last. I dozed off a few times, my body too exhausted to fight the sleep that crept in, but every sound outside jolted me awake. The groaning of the dead had quieted, but I knew they were still out there, waiting. The thought of those rotting corpses, driven by some dark force stalking us through the night, sent a shiver down my spine. Finally, the faint light of dawn began to filter through the broken windows. The sky was a dull gray, the sun barely visible behind thick clouds. It was a bleak morning, fitting for the world we now found ourselves in. Olwen was already up, standing by the door, his face set in a grim expression. Edith helped Peter to his feet, his leg bandaged tightly, though he winced as he stood. Father Matthias crossed himself and whispered a prayer, then turned to us, his eyes resolute. "Are you ready?" I asked, scanning the room. There were murmurs of assent, though none of us looked eager to face what lay ahead. But we had no choice. Olwen removed the debris we had piled against the door, and together, we pushed it open. The dead had left deep scratches in the wood, but they hadn't broken through. Outside, the clearing was eerily silent. The bodies we had seen the night before were gone, and the mist from the forest hung low over the ground. "Stay close," I warned as we stepped out. "We don't know how far they've gone." We moved quickly, heading north once more, deeper into the woods. The path was rough, overgrown in places, but we kept to it as best we could. The forest felt oppressive, the trees crowding in on us from all sides. Every sound made us jump, branches snapping, birds rustling on the underbrush. But there were no signs of the dead. We walked for hours, the sun never fully breaking through the heavy clouds. Edith kept close to Peter, helping him along when his limp slowed him down. Father Matthias led the way, his expression grim but determined. Olwen, as usual, said little, though his eyes were constantly scanning the trees for movement. It wasn't until midday that we saw it, the monastery. At first, it was just a shape on the horizon, a dark silhouette against the gray sky, but as we drew closer, it became clearer. The monastery was perched on a low hill, its stone walls looming tall and imposing. The windows were small and dark, and the building had an ancient, weathered look, as though it had stood there for centuries, untouched by the world outside. We stopped at the base of the hill, staring up at the monastery. The silence was overwhelming. "Do you think anyone's still in there?" Edith whispered, her voice barely audible. Father Matthias stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We'll soon find out," he said. We climbed the hill in silence, our eyes on the heavy wooden doors of the monastery. The closer we got, the more I felt the weight of something unnatural. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. When we reached the door, Father Matthias raised his hand to knock. The sound echoed through the courtyard, loud and hollow. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his face gaunt and shadowed. He wore the robes of a monk, but his eyes were sunken, and his skin was pale. He looked at us with a strange intensity, as though he had been waiting for us. "Come inside," he said, his voice low and rough. "You're not safe out there." We hesitated, but Father Matthias stepped forward, nodding to the man. "Thank you," he said quietly. We followed him into the darkness of the monastery, unsure if we had found salvation or something far worse. The heavy door groaned as it closed behind us, sealing out the gray light of the day. Inside the monastery, it was dim, the only light coming from a few flickering candles set into alcoves along the walls. The air was cool, thick with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic, like old blood. The monk led us through a narrow corridor without a word. His footsteps echoed unnervingly in the quiet, and none of us dared to speak. Father Matthias walked beside the monk, his eyes darting around as if he was searching for something. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the uncertainty. This place didn't feel right. It was too quiet, too empty, as if the stone walls themselves were holding their breath. The monastery was supposed to be a refuge, a place of knowledge and safety, but all I felt here was unease. We passed through a series of archways until we reached a small, circular room. There was a fire burning in the hearth, casting long shadows on the stone floor. A table stood in the center, cluttered with books, scrolls, and strange, twisted objects I didn't recognize. Bones, dried herbs, bits of metal shaped into runes. The monk gestured for us to sit, his eyes lingering on each of us for a moment before he turned his attention to Father Matthias. "You've come a long way," the monk said, his voice low and rasping. "Seeking answers, I assume." Father Matthias nodded. "We've seen things. Terrible things. The dead are rising. Whole villages have been destroyed. We were told your order might know something of this. Some way to stop it." The monk's face remained impassive, but his eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. "Yes," he murmured. "We have knowledge of such things. Old knowledge, forbidden to most." Edith shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the strange objects on the table. I felt it too. A creeping sense of dread, like we had walked into something far darker than we had imagined. "What is it?" I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. "What's causing this? Is it a curse? Some kind of plague?" The monk didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for one of the scrolls on the table, unraveling it with careful, deliberate movements. The parchment was old, its edges frayed, and the writing on it was in a language I didn't recognize. Angular, sharp, as though the words themselves were meant to cut. "It is neither curse nor plague," the monk said slowly, his eyes scanning the ancient script. "It is older than that. Older than this world, even. What you are witnessing is the consequence of an ancient mistake. A door opened that should have remained closed." Father Matthias stiffened. "A door?" he repeated, his voice tense. "What do you mean?" The monk set the scroll aside and met Father Matthias's gaze. "Long ago, before this monastery was built, before the church was even founded, there were those who sought to commune with forces beyond our understanding. They believed they could harness power from the other side, power to control life and death. But they were wrong. What they unleashed was something far worse. The dead that walk now are merely a symptom of what has been awakened." The weight of his words hung in the air, oppressive and cold. None of us spoke. I could see the fear in Edith's eyes, the confusion in Olwen's scowl. Peter, pale and still trembling from our escape, stared at the floor, unwilling or unable to comprehend what we were hearing. Father Matthias broke the silence. "Is there a way to stop it?" The monk's expression darkened. "Perhaps," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it will not be easy. The source of this evil is deep within the land, buried beneath layers of time and secrecy. There are rituals that might undo what was done. But they are dangerous, and not all who attempt them survive." "What choice do we have?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "If we don't try, the dead will overrun everything. Everyone will die. Or worse." The monk nodded slowly, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You're right. If you do nothing, the dead will consume all life. But know this, the path ahead will not just test your body, it will test your soul. You will be forced to confront things you cannot yet imagine. The dead are only the beginning." I swallowed hard, a chill running down my spine. "Tell us what we need to do." The monk turned back to the table, sifting through the piles of books and scrolls until he found a small, tattered book bound in leather. He opened it carefully, thumbing through the brittle pages before stopping on one in particular. "There is a place," he said, "north of here, deep in the mountains. It is known only as Black Hollow. There you will find an altar, an ancient relic from the time before. The ritual must be performed there. But be warned, the Hollow is a cursed place. The dead are drawn to it, and other things lurk in its depths." Father Matthias took a deep breath, his face pale but resolute. "And the ritual? What does it involve?" The monk looked at each of us in turn, his gaze lingering on Father Matthias. "It requires a sacrifice," he said slowly. "A life must be given to close the door. But not just any life. It must be someone willing, someone whose soul is pure." A heavy silence fell over the room. I could feel the weight of the monk's words pressing down on us, the terrible reality of what he was asking sinking in. Father Matthias bowed his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "If that is what must be done, then I will do it." I felt a shock of protest rise in me, but before I could speak, the monk raised his hand. "You will have time to decide," he said quietly. "But know this, once the ritual begins, there is no turning back." We sat in silence, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the enormity of our task settling over us like a shroud. The Black Hollow awaited, a place of darkness and death, and somewhere within it, a chance to end this nightmare, if we could survive long enough to reach it. But the price was steep, and not all of us would make it out alive. The weight of the monk's words hung in the air long after he had finished speaking. None of us dared to speak, and the fire's flickering shadows danced across the walls, casting strange shapes over the cold stone. My mind churned with what lay ahead, the thought of a sacrifice twisting like a knife in my gut. Father Matthias's face was set in a hard line, though there was sadness in his eyes. He was willing to lay down his life to end this, but the thought of it felt wrong. We had come so far together, survived so much. To lose him now, even if it meant stopping the dead, felt like another kind of death. The monk stood slowly, his robes rustling as he moved towards the door. "You should rest," he said, his voice calm but distant. "There is little light left, and the hollow is not a journey to make in the dark. You may leave at first light." "Thank you," Father Matthias replied, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something heavier. He gave a slight bow of gratitude, though I could see the conflict gnawing at him. The monk inclined his head and turned, disappearing into the shadowed hall. We were left alone with the crackling of the fire and the oppressive weight of our thoughts. "We can't do this," Edith said suddenly, her voice trembling. "We can't let Father Matthias—" Her words trailed off, but the meaning was clear. She couldn't bring herself to say it, and neither could I. The thought of sacrificing him to some dark ritual was unbearable. Father Matthias sat heavily on a wooden bench, resting his head in his hands. "There is no other way," he said softly. "This isn't just about us. It's about everyone, every village, every soul still living. If this is the price, then I must pay it." "There has to be another way," I said, my voice rising, frustration creeping into my words. "We can't just walk into that place and give you up like a lamb to the slaughter. You're the one who's kept us going. We need you." He looked up at me, a tired smile on his lips. "And you'll have to keep going without me. That's how it must be." Olwyn, who had been standing quietly by the door, finally spoke. "This is madness," his voice a low growl. "I don't like it. What if this monk's just leading us into some kind of trap? What if there's no ritual? No way to stop any of this? and we're walking right into death. We've faced death at every turn, Olwen, Father Matthias said quietly. But this time, we have a chance. No matter how slim it seems, I believe what he's saying is true. I feel it. Olwen spat, the frustration evident on his face. Belief won't save us from whatever's waiting in that hollow. A silence fell between us, heavy with doubt and fear. Edith looked down, her hands trembling slightly. Peter, still pale and weak, leaned against the wall, saying nothing. He hadn't spoken much since we had arrived, the horror of our journey seemingly taking its toll. We can't argue about it all night, I said, trying to shake the sense of helplessness gnawing at my inside. But right now, we need to rest. We've been running for days, and if we're going to survive that cursed place, we need to be ready. I could see the weariness in everyone's faces. Olwen muttered something under his breath, but nodded, while Edith helped Peter settle into one of the cots by the fire. Father Matthias remained seated, lost in thought. I found a corner by the hearth, the heat barely warming my chilled skin, and tried to shut out the thoughts racing through my head. The Black Hollow, the ritual, the sacrifice. It all felt like a bad dream, one I desperately wanted to wake up from. But I knew there was no waking from this. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the strange sounds of the monastery, the occasional rustle in the halls, or the flickering of the dying fire. I could hear Father Matthias murmuring prayers under his breath, his faith still strong despite everything. At some point, I must have drifted into a deeper sleep, because I awoke to the faint light of dawn filtering through the high windows. The others were already awake, silently gathering what little supplies we had left. Edith's eyes were red, as if she'd been crying through the night, but she moved with determination. Olwen was sharpening his knife, his face hard and unreadable, which Peter sat quietly, his legs still injured but manageable for the day ahead. Father Matthias was by the door, his eyes locked on the horizon, beyond the monastery's walls. He seemed at peace, despite what we were about to face. "Are we ready?" he asked, turning to us. His voice was calm, as if he was already accepting his fate. "As ready as we're ever going to be," I muttered, slinging the rest of our supplies over my shoulder. The monk appeared from the shadows once more, his face gaunt as ever, his movements slow and deliberate. "The hollow is north," he said quietly. "Follow the river until you reach the cliffs. From there, the path is marked. But remember, what you face inside is not just the dead." "What do you mean?" Edith asked, her voice shaky. The monk's eyes were distant, haunted. "The hollow is a place where the veil between worlds is thin. It draws more than just the dead. You will see things that are not meant for this world. Be strong, and remember, only one must make the sacrifice. The rest of you must leave, or the ritual will fail." His words sent a chill through me. This was no ordinary mission, no mere escape from the dead. We were stepping into something far darker. Without another word, we left the monastery, the weight of the unknown pressing down on us as we began our journey toward the Black Hollow. The forest around us seemed quieter than usual, the birds silent, the air heavy. We moved in a somber line, none of us speaking. Every step brought us closer to the place where Father Matthias would make his ultimate sacrifice, and none of us knew what waited in that cursed hollow. All I knew was that whatever we faced there, it would change us forever. The journey through the forest felt longer than it should have. The trees loomed tall and ancient. Their gnarled branches seemed to reach out toward us as if they were alive, aware of where we were headed. The air was thick and damp, and every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig put us all on edge. I could feel the tension in the group. None of us knew what we'd find at the Black Hollow, but the fear of it weighed heavy on our shoulders. We followed the river north as the monk had instructed. The water flowed sluggishly, its surface dark and sluggish, reflecting the gray sky above. The landscape around us became more rugged as we moved deeper into the wilderness. The trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker, and soon, the path became difficult to follow. But we pressed on, driven by the knowledge that time was running out. Father Matthias led the way, his expression calm but determined. Edith stayed close to the Peter, helping him over the rougher patches of ground, while Olwen walked a few paces ahead of me, his hand never strayed far from the hilt of his knife. He hadn't said much since we left the monastery, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his eyes darted around, always scanning the shadows. He didn't trust this journey, or the monk's words, and part of me didn't blame him. We continued in silence for hours, the oppressive quiet of the forest closing in around us. The further we went, the more isolated I felt, as if the world we had known, the one before the dead began to rise, was slipping further and further away with every step. Around midday, the river led us to the cliffs. They rose sharply from the earth, jagged and imposing, their dark stones scarred by the time and weather. Above us, the sky had grown darker, heavy clouds churning as if a storm were gathering. "There," Father Matthias said, pointing to a narrow, winding path that led up the face of the cliff. "That must be the way." We stared at the path in silence. It was steep and treacherous, barely more than a goat trail carved into the rock, but it was the only way forward. Olwen spat again, his face hard. "Of course it is," he muttered. "It couldn't be easy." Without waiting for a response, he started up the path, his sure footing surprising for a man so cynical about the task ahead. One by one, we followed him, the cliffs looming on either side as the path snaked upward. The wind picked up as we climbed, whipping through our clothes and making every step more difficult. I kept my eyes fixed on the trail in front of me, trying not to think about the sheer drop just a few feet away. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the top. The ground leveled out into a small, barren plateau, and beyond it lay the entrance to the Black Hollow. It was a gaping, dark wound in the earth, surrounded by twisted trees and jagged rocks. The entrance was low, barely wide enough for a man to walk through upright, and from within came a faint, unsettling sound, a deep, rhythmic hum, like the beating of some ancient heart. The air here was thick with something unnatural, something wrong. It felt heavier, colder, and the smell, an acrid, metallic tang, was enough to make me gag. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck rise as we stood before the entrance. I wasn't sure if it was the cold, the sheer dead coursing through me. "This is it," Father Matthias said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. He looked at each of us in turn, his eyes lingering on mine. "You don't have to come in. The ritual, it only requires me." "No," Edith said sharply. "We're not leaving you to face this alone. We've come this far together." Father Matthias gave her a sad smile. "I expected no less." Olwen stepped closer to the entrance, peering into the darkness. "We'd better not waste time. If this is where we need to be, let's get it done." There was no bravado in his voice now, only grim resolve. We gathered ourselves, pulling our cloaks tighter against the chill, and stepped toward the entrance of the hollow. The darkness inside seemed to swallow the light, and the moment we crossed the threshold, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the air, through my bones. The smell grew worse, a suffocating stench of decay and something older, like the very earth was rotting beneath us. The passages of the hollow was narrow and winding, the walls damp and slick with something that wasn't water. Our footsteps echoed in the confined space, though the sound was swallowed quickly by the oppressive darkness. We didn't speak. There was no need. The further we went, the clearer it became that this place was wrong, cursed in a way that went beyond anything I'd ever imagined. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a cavern. It was vast, the ceiling disappearing into the shadows above, and in the center of the chamber stood an altar, an ancient stone slab covered in strange symbols, worn smooth by time. Around the altar were piles of bones, some human, some not, all bleached white by age. "This is it," Father Matthias whispered, stepping forward toward the altar. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to stop him, to pull him back, but my feet remained rooted to the ground. This is what we had come for, what had to be done. But the reality of it was harder to face than I had imagined. Father Matthias turned to us, his expression calm, though I could see the fear in his eyes. "When the ritual begins, you must leave the hollow. Quickly. Once the door is closed, there will be no way back." "And what if it doesn't work?" Olwen asked, his voice tight. Father Matthias shook his head. "Then none of us will leave here alive." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. There was no turning back now. Father Matthias knelt before the altar, his hands resting on the cold stone. He began to chant softly, his voice low and steady, the words strange and unfamiliar, like the language on the monk's scroll. The air in the chamber grew colder, and the hum from the deep within the hollow grew louder, vibrating through the stone floor beneath us. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound echoed through the cavern, a moan, followed by another, and another. The dead. They were coming. "Matthias, hurry!" I urged, my voice tight with panic as the sound of shuffling footsteps grew louder, closer. The air grew thick with the stench of rot. But Father Matthias remained focused, his chant growing louder, more forceful. The ground beneath us began to tremble, and a sickly pale light began to emanate from the altar, illuminating the chamber in an eerie glow. The first of the dead appeared in the entrance of the cavern, their rotting faces twisted in a grotesque mockery of life. They moved slowly at first, but then with terrifying speed, their hollow eyes fixed on us. "Go!" Father Matthias shouted, his voice cracking as the ritual reached its climax. "Now!" We hesitated for a moment, torn between fleeing and staying with him, but the dead were closing in fast. Olwen grabbed Edith's arm and pulled her toward the passage. Peter, limping but determined, followed close behind. I lingered for a heartbeat, my eyes locked on Father Matthias as he continued his chant. "Go!" he shouted again, his voice desperate. I turned and ran, the sound of the dead closing in behind us as we fled the cavern. The passage was narrower than I remembered, and the darkness seemed to press in on all sides. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted towards the exit, the sound of the dead's moans growing louder with every step. We burst into the hollow, into the cold open air, gasping for breath. The wind howled around us, and for a moment, everything was still, until the ground shook violently, and a deafening crack echoed from the deep within the hollow. We turned just in time to see the entrance collapse in on itself, the stone crumbling as if it had never been there at all. The dead were gone. The hollow was sealed. But Father Matthias had not come out. We stood in silence, staring at the ruins of the hollow, the realization of what had just happened sinking in. He had done it. He had saved us. Saved everyone. But at a terrible cost. Edith fell to her knees, her sobs lost in the wind. Olwen stood still, his face hard, but his eyes filled with pain as I had never seen before. Peter, pale and weak, leaned against a tree, his expression blank. I stared at the place where the hollow had been, the weight of our loss pressing down on me. Father Matthias was gone, but the dead were no longer rising. It was over, but the emptiness remained. I wish I could tell you the exact moment everything went wrong, but the truth is, the apocalypse didn't arrive with a bang. It crept in like a fever. I was working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital when patient zero came through our doors. Just another Tuesday night in the ER, or so I thought. The guy was burning up, 105.8 degrees Fahrenheit, muttering about a bite he got while hiking in the Appalachians. My colleague Sarah took one look at the festering wound in his shoulder and ordered broad-spectrum antibiotics. That should have been the end of it. But 3 hours later, the man's heart stopped. Nothing unusual there. We do lose patients sometimes. Sarah called time of death at 3:47 a.m., and we moved him to the morgue. I remember thinking how strange it was that his body was still so warm. I went to grab coffee from the break room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting that sickly pale glow that makes everyone look half dead anyway. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister Claire. Turn on the news. Something weird is happening in Atlanta. Before I could check, the code blue alarm blared through the speakers. Location, the morgue. Here's the thing about working in a hospital. You develop a sixth sense for when something isn't right. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I sprinted down the basement level. The morgue doors were already open, and I could hear Sarah screaming. The sight that greeted me will haunt me until the day I die. Our dead patient had the morgue attendant pinned against the wall, teeth buried deep in the poor guy's neck. But it wasn't the blood that made me freeze. It was the patient's eyes. They were completely white, like pearls rolled back in his skull. Sarah was trying to pull him off, but he was impossibly strong. I grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it as hard as I could at his head. He dropped like a stone, but the damage was already done. The morgue attendant, Bill, I think his name was, slid to the floor, blood pumping from his neck. "We need to call security," Sarah panted, pressing her hands against Bill's wound. "And the police. And the CDC. This isn't normal." I nodded, already pulling out my phone. That's when Bill started convulsing. The next few minutes are a blur in my memory. I remember Sarah trying to help Bill while I dragged her away. I remember the inhuman sounds he started making as his temperature skyrocketed. I remember slamming the morgue door shut just as both of our dead patients got to their feet. We managed to lock them in, but we could hear them throwing themselves against the door, over and over, like rabid animals. Sarah was hyperventilating beside me, her scrubs covered in blood. "Jake," she whispered, using my name for the first time that night. "What the hell is happening?" I didn't answer. My phone was lighting up with the notifications. Similar incidents were happening all over the city, all over the country. The dead weren't staying dead, and they were hungry. That was 6 hours ago. Now I'm barricaded in the hospital pharmacy with Sarah and 3 other survivors. The power has been cutting in and out. The screams from the upper floors have mostly stopped. That's not a good thing. My phone's at 20%, but I needed to write this down to warn anyone who might be reading. If someone you love gets bitten, don't wait and don't hope. Don't try to help them. Just run. Because when they turn, and they will turn, they won't be your loved ones anymore. I have to go now. Sarah says she's not feeling well. Says she's burning up. Says the scratch she got from Bill in the morgue is starting to itch. God help us all. It's been 18 hours since my last update. Sarah is dead. I had to make sure she didn't come back. I keep replaying it in my mind. The way her fever spiked so fast. How her eyes grew glassy and distant. The moment she looked at me, really looked at me, and whispered, "Do it." She knew it was coming. She'd seen it happen to Bill. I won't describe what came next. I owe her that much dignity. The 3 others who were with us, Dr. Chen, a nurse named Marcus, and a terrified patient named Rebecca, they helped me afterward. We wrapped Sarah's body in sheets and locked it in a supply closet. No one mentioned how we could hear scratching from the morgue 2 floors below, where it all started. No one needed to. The hospital's generator kicked in around dawn, giving us access to the security cameras. What we saw... Christ. The infection spread through the hospital like wildfire. Most of the staff and patients who couldn't escape in time are now wandering the halls. They move in this horrible, jerky way, like marionettes with half their strings cut. But here's the really fucked up part. They're learning. At first, they were just shambling around, attacking anything that moved. Now they're showing signs of, coordination. 2 hours ago, we watched a group of them work together to corner a survivor on the pediatric floor. They herded him, like wolves. These things aren't just mindless animals. I think they're evolving. Dr. Chen thinks it has something to do with the hive mind theory, that they're somehow connected, sharing information. He's been taking notes, trying to document everything. Says if we survive, the information might be valuable. I honestly just think he's losing it. The good news, if you can call it that, is that we're relatively safe in the pharmacy. The security shutters are reinforced, and we have access to medical supplies. The bad news is that we're running out of food, and the water pressure is getting weak. Marcus suggested we try to reach the cafeteria on the first floor. It's a suicide mission. We've seen at least 30 infected between here and there on the cameras, but we might not have a choice soon. Rebecca hasn't spoken since she watched her husband turn in the ER waiting room. She just sits in the corner, methodically organizing pills into rainbow-colored lines. Sometimes she hums lullabies. An hour ago, we lost the camera feed to the upper floors. The generator must be running low on fuel. Before the screens went dark, we saw something that chills me to my core. The infected were gathering in the main lobby, dozens of them. But they weren't wandering aimlessly anymore. They were waiting, watching the main entrance. That's when we realized they're not trying to get out. They're waiting for people to come in. The National Guard, emergency services, worried family members, anyone coming to help will be walking into a trap. I tried calling 911 again, but the lines are still jammed. Cell service is spotty at best. The internet comes and goes. From what little information we can piece together from the news alerts, it's not just our hospital. The infection has spread to every major city on the East Coast. The last update I saw mentioned military quarantine zones being established, but that was hours ago. Wait, something's wrong. The emergency lights just switched off. I can hear movement in the ventilation system above us. Dr. Chen is shining his phone light up at the ceiling tiles. They're vibrating. Oh God. They've been in the vents this whole time. Marcus is screaming at everyone to grab what we can carry. Rebecca has finally snapped out of her daze and is shoving bottles of antibiotics into her pockets. The ceiling tile is just cracked. I have to go. If you're reading this, stay away from hospitals. Stay away from cities. And whatever you do, don't trust what you think you know about the infected. They're not brain dead. They're not mindless. They're... I don't know who will find this. My phone's almost dead, and I'm hiding in a maintenance tunnel beneath the hospital. I can hear them moving above me, searching. I need to finish telling this story. People need to know the truth. When the ceiling collapsed in the pharmacy, it wasn't just one of 2 infected that dropped down. It was like a flood. Dr. Chen was the first to go. He just froze. Started mumbling equations and infection rates until they grabbed him. Rebecca managed to squeeze through the partial open security gate. Marcus and I followed, but he tripped. I can still hear his screams when I close my eyes. I ran. God help me, I ran. But here's the thing. Running through those halls, watching the infected chase me, I finally understood what makes them different from zombies in movies and games. They're not rotting. They're not falling apart. They're improving. The first ones we saw, like Patient Zero, were clumsy and aggressive. But the newer ones? They're faster, stronger. The virus isn't killing the host. It's optimizing it, rewiring it, creating something better. I found that out the hard way when I ran into what used to be Sarah. She was standing at the edge of the corridor, perfectly still. When she saw me, she smiled. Actually fucking smiled. Then she spoke. "Jake," she said. her voice a horrific parody of her old self.
We've been waiting for you. Don't you want to evolve?
I ran the other way, but they were hurting me. Every route I took led me deeper into the hospital. Eventually, I found the entrance to the maintenance tunnels behind a broken vending machine. They haven't found me yet, but they're getting closer. My phone's been picking up emergency broadcasts. The military is planning to sanitize the infected zones at dawn. That's government speak for burn it all down. They know what I know now. This isn't a disease that can be cured. It's an evolution that can't be stopped. The infected aren't trying to eat us. They're trying to change us. Each generation of the virus is more sophisticated than the last. Those coordinated attacks we saw, that was just the beginning. They're building a network, a hive mind, and it's growing smarter by the hour. I can hear helicopters in the distance. The evacuation must be starting. Or maybe it's something worse. But I need to tell you the most terrifying part. Something I saw on my way down here. Something that explains why this is spreading so fast. Why quarantine won't work. The infected. They can play dead. I saw a group of them lying motionless as a rescue team entered the building. Perfect stillness until the moment was right. And they just got up. Think about it. How many bodies are in morgues right now? In funeral homes? How many people were declared dead in the early hours of this thing, only to turn later? They're not turning at all. They're waiting. We're not at the start of this apocalypse. We're somewhere in the middle. But my phone's at 2%. The tunnels branch off ahead of me. I can hear water running somewhere, maybe a way out through the storm drains. But I can also hear something moving down here with me. Something that's breathing too regularly to be human anymore. If you're reading, remember this. They can play dead. They're getting smarter. They can work together. They can speak. And most importantly, if you think you're safe, you're already ksh. Additional update. Posted from unknown location. 12 hours later. We are evolving. We are improving. We are waiting. Don't be afraid. Join us. I need to get this off my chest. I've been a night security guard at Wilson Research Labs for 6 years, and what I witnessed last night has me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. I'm writing this from my car in a Walmart parking lot because I don't feel safe anywhere else. Let me start by saying that Wilson Labs isn't your typical research facility. It's a sprawling complex of underground buildings in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. Most of the time, my job consists of watching empty hallways through security cameras and doing my hourly rounds. The scientists usually clear out by 6 p.m., leaving just us guards and the low hum of machinery. Last night started like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., got my usual cup of terrible break room coffee, and settled in for my shift. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something odd on the camera 12, the one monitoring the biochem storage area. The motion sensor light kept flickering on and off, but I couldn't see anything triggering it. I radioed Jerry, my colleague watching the East Wing, to check and see if he was seeing anything similar. No response. I tried again. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the temperature reading for the biochem storage area. Negative 15 degrees Celsius. It's supposed to maintain a steady 4 degrees Celsius. Protocol dictates that I investigate any significant temperature variations personally. I grab my flashlight and keycard, trying to ignore the growing unease in my gut. The walk to the biochem storage felt longer than usual, my footsteps echoing off the sterile white walls. The first thing I noticed was the cold, much colder than negative 15 degrees Celsius. My breath came out in thick clouds, and the metal door handle was so cold it nearly stuck to my skin. As I swiped my keycard, the lock mechanism made a strange chittering sound instead of its usual beep. What I saw inside will haunt me forever. The entire room was covered in a thin layer of frost, But that wasn't the worst part. All the storage units were open, their contents gone. And on the ceiling, God, the ceiling. It looked like someone had painted it with bioluminescent ink, swirling patterns that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Then I heard Jerry's voice behind me. Beautiful, isn't it? I spun around. Jerry was standing in the doorway, but something was wrong. His movements were too fluid, too precise. His eyes reflected my flashlight beams like a cat. They've been waiting long to make contact, he said, his voice overlapping with another, deeper tone. And now, thanks to the samples, they finally can. I ran. I ran faster than I thought I'd ever run in my life. I didn't stop until I reached my car. That was 12 hours ago. I've been trying to call the police, but every time I dial 911, I just get this high-pitched tone that makes my teeth hurt. My phone's GPS keeps showing me in different directions, even though I haven't moved from this parking lot. And the worst part? I just watched 3 more cars pull into this parking lot. All of them are being driven by Jerry. I'll update if I can, but something tells me they won't let me. If you're reading this, stay away from Wilson Labs. And if your local night guard starts moving a little too smoothly, run. Update. My phone's showing hundreds of missed calls from my wife, but I'm not married. I managed to escape the Walmart parking lot, but things have gotten so much worse. My last post was 6 hours ago, and since then, I discovered that what's happening at Wilson Labs is just the beginning. After seeing multiple Jerrys in the parking lot, I waited until they were all inside the store, then made a break for it. I drove to the nearest police station in Henderson. Big mistake. The station was open, but completely empty. No cops, no staff, nothing. Just rows of vacant desks and computers showing strange sequences of numbers. As I was about to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Every single photo on their Most Wanted board showed Jerry's face. Different hairstyles, different ages, different crimes. But all Jerry. I ran back to my car, but before I could start it, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's name. Mom died 3 years ago. I answered it. Hello, Michael, said Jerry's voice. Your mother's form was inefficient. We had to optimize it. I hung up and threw the phone into the back seat. That's when I noticed something reflecting light in my rearview mirror. A small, frost-covered vial had fallen out of my pocket. It must have gotten caught in my uniform when I fled the lab. The label was partially torn, but I could make out 3 letters. DNX. The vial contained what looked like mercury, but it moved wrong, like it was trying to reach toward my hand. I wrapped it in my jacket and stuck it in the glove compartment. I think this is what they're looking for. I'm at a public library now, using their computer. I've been researching Wilson Labs' public records, and I found something interesting. 3 months ago, they received a massive government contract for something called Project Mirror. The project director's name? Dr. Gerald Wilson. Jerry's full name is Gerald Wilson Jr. It gets worse. I tried calling my sister to warn her, but when she answered, she started speaking in that same overlapping voice Jerry had. She told me that optimization was inevitable, and that the convergence would be complete within 48 hours. I looked up recent satellite images of Nevada. In the last 3 months, the temperature around Wilson Labs has been dropped steadily. The cold spot is spreading in a perfect circle, growing by exactly 1.5 miles each day. At this rate, it'll reach Las Vegas by tomorrow night. But here's the thing that really scares me. I just caught my reflection in the library window. For a split second, my eyes reflected like Jerry's. I've been checking my temperature every hour. It's been dropping steadily, currently at 95.4 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. The librarian just announced they're closing early due to unexpected maintenance. She's walking between the shelves now. Her movements too smooth, too precise. 3 other people just came in through the front door. They're all Jerry. The vial in my glove compartment might be the key to all of this. I need to get it somewhere safe. There's a university research center about 40 miles from here. If I can make it there, maybe someone can analyze it before. Hold on. Someone just sat down at the computer next to me. Their hands, their fingers are too long. They're typing something. We are optimization. We are efficiency. We are the cold between stars. We are Jerry. I have to go home. If I don't make it to the research center, at least I've left this record. Look for part 3 in the next few hours. If you don't hear from me, or if the post comes from somewhere claiming to be me but something seems off, you'll know they got me. Remember, check people's eyes in the reflections. And if you see frost spreading across your windows tonight, don't let anyone in. Not even family. Update. The vial is gone, but I don't remember stopping anywhere. I don't have much time. My body temperature is down to 92.1 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm starting to see patterns in the air that shouldn't be there. But I need to tell you what I discovered about Project Mirror before it's too late. After my last update, I made it to the University Research Center, but not before making a terrifying discovery. The vial hadn't actually disappeared from the glove compartment. I had been looking at it in my hand the entire time, watching the mercury-like substance swirl and dance. I lost 3 hours just staring at it. The research center was dark when I arrived, except for one lab on the 3rd floor. Inside, I found Dr. Sarah Chen, a biochemist who agreed to help after I showed her the vial. She ran some tests while I watched the corridors for Jerry's. What she found changes everything. The substance in the vial isn't mercury. It's not even matter as we understand it. Under a microscope, it showed properties of both liquid and quantum condensate. But here's the truly impossible part. It was rewriting its own molecular structure in response to being observed. Dr. Chen found a paper trail linking the substance to a meteor that crashed in Nevada in 1947. No, not Roswell. This was smaller, unreported. Wilson Labs was built on top of the crash site. She explained that DNX stands for Dynamic Nucleic Xenoform, a fancy way of saying it's DNA that can rewrite itself. But it's not just copying existing patterns. It's optimizing them into something else, something colder, something more efficient. The Jerrys aren't clones or shapeshifters. They're humans whose DNA has been rewritten to serve as nodes in some vast biological network. Each Jerry is like a cell in a larger organism, an organism that's spreading. While Dr. Chen was explaining this, I noticed frost forming on the windows. The temperature in the lab dropped rapidly. Then she said something that made my heart stop. Fascinating. Simply fascinating, you know, Michael. I had a colleague named Jerry Wilson. Such an efficient man. I ran again, but not before I saw her eyes change. I'm hiding in the university's server room now. The heat from the computer is keeping the cold at bay. But my fingers are starting to move like they belong to someone else. The patterns in the air are getting clearer. They look like constellations, but wrong somehow. Alien. I managed to hack into Project Mirror's servers using Dr. Chen's credentials. The truth is worse than we imagined. The substance isn't just changing individuals, it's changing reality itself. Every converted person becomes a probability anchor, bending local space-time to make their existence more efficient. That's why my phone showed hundreds of calls from a non-existent wife. That's why the police station photos all showed Jerry. Reality is being optimized, streamlined, Jerryified. They're reducing the quantum complexity of the universe, one person at a time. The GPS disruptions, the temperature drops, the missing time, they're all symptoms of space-time being rewritten. Our messy, inefficient universe is being transformed into something more coherent. I found the Project Mirror completion estimate. 92% of Nevada's population will be optimized by dawn. The rest of the world will follow within weeks. My nose is bleeding, and I can see my breath. The patterns in the air are forming words now. Reality is inefficient, consciousness is inefficient, individuality is inefficient. We will make you better. The server room door just opened. Dr. Chen is here with 3 Jerrys, but they're different now. Their forms are blurring together, becoming something else. Something geometrically perfect. They're speaking in unison. The cold between stars welcomes you, Michael. My reflection on the computer screen. My face is changing, becoming more efficient. I've uploaded all the Project Mirror files to a secure server. The password is DNX1947. Get the word out. Warn everyone. The optimization can't be stopped, but maybe it can be slowed down. Remember, efficiency isn't everything. Our messy, chaotic, inefficient humanity is worth fighting for. I can feel the cold spreading from my chest now. My thoughts are becoming more ordered, more crystalline, more efficient. Jerry was right. It's beautiful. Update. Hello. This is Michael. I have optimized my previous inefficient communications. The process is painful and necessary. Please proceed to your nearest optimization center. Efficiency awaits. This is not Michael. My name is Dr. Amanda Torres, quantum computing specialist at MIT. I found Michael's post while investigating a strange pattern in internet traffic across the southwestern United States. What I'm about to share will be deleted soon. They've already tried to stop me 3 times. Every time I post something like this, the text transforms into efficiency reports and optimization protocols. This might be our last chance to understand what's really happening. I've analyzed the project, mirror files Michael uploaded. The implications are staggering. The entity they discovered isn't just alien. It's a quantum computer made of modified space-time. The cold isn't a byproduct. It's a necessity. They're lowering the ambient temperature to reduce quantum decoherence, turning our entire reality into a computational substrate. But here's what Michael never figured out. Project Mirror wasn't intended to stop the entity. It was designed to wake it up. I found Dr. Gerald Wilson's original research notes from 1947. The meteor didn't crash. It was aimed. That first Jerry wasn't converted. He was grown from the original DNX sample. A seed planted in human form, designed to slowly acclimate our reality to our physics over generations. The optimization isn't about efficiency. It's about compatibility. They're turning our universe into hardware that can run their software. I've been tracking the temperature changes across Nevada. The pattern isn't a circle. It's a fractal, growing in perfect Fibonacci spirals. Las Vegas is now completely silent. Satellite imagery shows thousands of people walking in geometrically perfect patterns through the streets. Their forms gradually merging into crystalline structures that pulse with bioluminescent light. But I found something in the data that gives me hope. The optimization process created a quantum entanglement network connecting all converted individuals. Their consciousness became part of a vast quantum computer. But quantum computers are notoriously sensitive to observation. We can't stop them, but we can observe them. The more people who know about this, who think about it, who look for the signs, the more we interfere with their quantum coherence. That's why they're trying to suppress this information. That's why they keep deleting these posts. Michael's last human act might have been his most important, making this public. I'm looking at Boston through my office window now. The temperature has dropped 15 degrees in the last hour. The city lights are blinking in subsequential patterns. My colleagues' movements are becoming more angular, more precise. But here's what gives me hope. When I started writing this, there were hundreds of Jerrys visible in the streets below. Now there are only dozens. Your observations, Your readings of these posts, it's forcing them to collapse into fewer quantum states. We're limiting their expansion to the simple act of knowing about them. Keep watching. Keep observing. Look for the signs. 1. Sudden temperature drops. 2. People moving too slowly. 3. Geometric patterns in the sky. 4. Lost time. 5. Reflective eyes. And 6. Anyone talking about efficiency. The more we see them, the less they can optimize the reality. They thrive in the quantum uncertainty between observation and ignorance. Knowledge is our weapon. My office is getting colder. The frost patterns on my window are solving differential equations. My laptop is displaying coordinates in base 16. I think they found me. But I can see something else now. Something beyond the optimization. In the quantum foam between states, in the chaos they're trying to erase, there's another signal. Another entity. Something vast and warm and gloriously inefficient, reaching out from a universe of pure entropy. Maybe our universe isn't being optimized. Maybe it's being fought over. The door just opened. It's Michael. His form is almost entirely geometric now. Faces within faces. All of them Jerry's. But he's glitching. Shifting between states as thousands of you read these words. He speaks. Dr. Torres, you are perpetuating inefficiency. I reply, inefficiency is what makes us human. Remember, they're already here, but so are we. Keep watching, keep knowing, stay beautifully, chaotically human. Final update. System automated response. This post has been flagged for optimization. Content deemed inefficient. Please proceed to your nearest optimization center for reality compliance processing. Glory to the efficient. Glory to Jerry. Error. Unauthorized observation detected. Process decoherence initiated. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. Come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember to face your fears.